Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime. I'm Ryan Salisbury, and today I have a co-host, Teen from
Hey, what's
Escape
going
from
on?
Plan A.
Yep.
Hey Teen.
Hey, how's it going, Ryan? Mm-hmm.
Good. So today we're talking about modern monetary theory, which Teen hit me up about a couple months ago because he saw that we did something on it, and we left you out. So
No,
I wanted
you didn't.
to,
You asked
come
if I
on
could
and talk
join.
about it.
Well, you guys didn't leave me out. You were nice enough to ask me if I could join. I just couldn't do it that day. But I was like, fuck, because I love this topic, and I was happy you guys did one on it. And but I figure if you've already addressed it, you guys did a good job on it, I guess. But like,
I honestly don't even remember what we said about it, so we might be recovering some ground, but I think that's okay because you got to repeat stuff to really learn it.
Yeah, but you guys are really. I mean, your Neighbor Science. You guys get really in depth, like with detail and stuff.
Oh, thanks.
Which is it's good. But like, also, I think though with MMT, sometimes it's almost like the details end up confusing people. Almost
that
more,
that is true. I think yeah. So what's your interest in MMT?
My interest in MMT is just that I've worked in finance for a while, and MMT is basically, in my mind, sort of it came out of academics that really knew what the boring day-to-day life of finance professionals actually entailed in terms of how payments are made, in terms of how treasuries are settled. Like, they were actually looking at money operations and saying that, wait, this doesn't comport at all with how money operations are described in economics textbooks. So I just thought it was really interesting because it was like, actual. I remember the first time I saw MMT.
After 200 years, economists finally learned how to read a balance sheet.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because it's like you get a lot. Like, I was watching some MMT stuff on YouTube, and it was all these like traders and stuff, and people who worked on fixed income desks and stuff, going to these things, going, "Yep, that's how we see it too." So I just thought it was interesting because this is not like. MMT doesn't come from like from up on high. It's like sort of like that grunt class finance professional that would look at this and say, "Yep, I think that's exactly how it works."
So, as someone with experience in finance, like, how do you perceive like mainstream economics and like how they describe the economy?
The thing about MMT that's most interesting is how it directly addresses one of the core political, smokescreens that you see, which is that the national debt is exploding. It's at $12 trillion. We're going to be spending more on interest payments and basically saddling our kids, and they're going to be indentured servants to China and other treasury holders in the future. And then it's both sides saying this. It's fucking liberals and conservatives saying this stuff. And it's insane because they've been saying it since forever. They've been saying it since the beginning of the 20th century, and it's never come true. Right. We've never had our children become indentured servants of those who hold U.S. Treasury bonds. But they keep saying it. They still say it. One
of the reasons I got into gear on doing this episode is because of the Democratic debate on the 14th, where they kept asking, mainly Bernie, over and over, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And the answer is, who gives a fuck?
Right.
The answer is government spending.
Yeah. I mean, he has a good answer. I mean, I like his answer, which is more rooted in material. Like, he doesn't think about the money so much as the fact that we already are paying for the health services. So what do you mean? How are we going to pay for it? We already are paying for it.
Yeah, I made the Shaq meme where he's like, something I sleep, something real shit. I made one which was like, people going into debt to pay for healthcare. I sleep. government going into debt to pay for healthcare, real shit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I mean, that's basically what their argument is. It's bad for the government to pay for stuff, but people paying for stuff is very, very good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just to introduce MMT for anyone who isn't really aware of it, MMT is basically an update of an old theory called chartalism, which there's basically two theories to explain the origin of money. One is chartalism and one is metalism. So metalism says that money is, basically like a magic special like token that springs forth from, I don't know, nowhere. And the government has to like appropriate it somehow, and then like its value depends on how much there is in supply, and has to be based on a real commodity, and just like all of the nonsense theories of money are under that umbrella. And then chartalism is the idea that money is created by states in order to mobilize workers, and all money's value is like fiat. So the reason that you get money is because the state controls resources and workers, and you need their money in order to acquire those resources or pay those workers. So modern monetary theory is basically just chartalism with central banking added to it, because capitalism uses central banks as its main source of money in the economy.
See, that's the neighbor science breakdown that I'm talking about. You guys start from these real intellectual fundamentals. So it sounds like to me, because I'm not familiar with metalism or chartalism as concepts, but it sounds like metalism is broadly the idea that money is inherently valuable and scarce, whereas chartalism is saying that no, money's a social fiction that's created by some governmental authority. Is sort of like one way to distinguish the two, or?
Yeah, like, I mean, one of the main, like, alternative theories of money is that it sprang forth from barter. So, 12,000 years ago, we were all trading cows for chickens with our neighbors. And then some smart guy figured out, oh, man, that's really inefficient. We should actually use pieces of paper or metal
that's
coins
the predominant view.
instead.
I mean,
yes.
Yeah, that's the predominant view, where you go to any of those Econ 101 textbooks and they're always like, imagine a world without money, and a guy brings chickens to markets, but he wants a haircut, and the barber doesn't want chickens, he wants planks, and this guy wants nails.
That's what capitalism is.
You know who does a good job of breaking that fiction down is David Graeber's Debt. The first 5,000 years.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah, I'm like I read the Barnes and Noble's editor's picks. That's me, and that's a good book to sort of get through that myth.
Yeah, I would also recommend that. It's something like 400 pages, but it's actually a very breezy read. I think Graeber
he's
is
a good writer. He's very accessible. Yeah.
Because to me, a good writer is someone who makes you interested in what you're reading.
Yes.
Not someone who uses like flowery language or any shit like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think David Graeber makes the stuff that he writes very interesting to read.
Yeah.
Like his the book he released after that, The Utopia of Rules, I read it in its entirety on a plane trip.
Yeah, I think because he's an anthropologist, I think he's a lot more like engaging in many ways than like say an economist.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So let's see. What do we have to talk about with MMT? So I've looked at this tool a lot on econviz, econviz.org.
Yeah.
They call it the macroeconomic balance sheet visualizer, because one of the things about the modern economy is despite me railing on economists constantly, they are kind of correct that the economy is pretty complex and hard to understand. Just they're wrong about which areas are hard to understand. So if you stare at this like macroeconomic balance sheet visualizer for a while, you might start to get how central banking and commercial banking and all that stuff works. But it like the tool basically explains like these different operations that the government and the central bank and commercial banks and households can go through. And it lets you like move money around the economy. And the purpose of it is to show you how the government can spend money without having to collect it like revenue via taxes, which is like the main thing that MMT is trying to put forth into the world, that the government doesn't have to tax you in order to spend things on public services.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like the starting point for MMT in terms of how I have learned about it. I mean, I'm not going to say I fully understand it, but I think the basics are pretty clear.
No one does.
Yeah. Well, no one does, because it's never been it's both. I mean, MMT is a description of how things already work. So when people are going like, oh, you can't do MMT, you know, modern monetary theorists are kind of saying, no, that's already what you're doing.
Right.
It's more like you don't understand what you're doing, but you're already doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the starting point for me was to understand that we often treat the federal government as another market player, another player in the economy, the same way that a company would be a player in the economy, or a person, or a family for that matter.
Right.
And that, like a company or like an individual, like we have budgetary constraints. We can only spend what we take in. To the extent we spend more than what we take in, we have to borrow money so that we have to pay it back in the future. And there's an interest rate attached to it and all that stuff.
And if you don't pay your debts back, the IRS will garnish your wages.
Yeah, exactly. and we're doing debtor prisons now and shit too. So you'll probably end up
that's
going to jail.
That's why we need to worry about the national debt, because we don't want the IRS to garnish the government's wages.
Right. And of course, if the U.S. government doesn't pay, then of course its bank account, its bankers at J.P. Morgan is going to sue the U.S. government and put them in debtor prison.
It's not going to be able to buy any more houses.
Right. And this view is entirely wrong, of course, because the government is not like the others. The federal government, state government would be subject to budgetary constraints the same way a company would. But when you're talking about the government that issues the currency, it's fundamentally different. They're on a completely different position, and they're more like the house dealer. And we're all living in the casino, and we have to play with the chips, but they create the chips. And so it's just totally different when it comes to the federal government. Is that the sort of starting point for MMT is saying there is a completely different relationship with money when you're the currency issuer.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that, I try to drive that home to a lot of people that, I mean, there's like this idea that people just pick up through osmosis, like even without taking an econ class. Although if you take an econ class, you will believe this even more. But the general idea is that the government has to raise money by taxing people in order to spend it. And if it doesn't do that, then either it can't because reasons, no one can ever explain why, or if it does create money, it will cause inflation.
Right. That's
the other big thing.
Yeah, which MMT doesn't deny.
MMT
doesn't
deny
that
it. They deny it up to the point where the government achieves full employment. And this is where I disagree with them, because their idea of inflation is demand pull inflation, which is like basically applying supply and demand to the price of money, which doesn't exist. Like inflation is treated as like the value of money. So like if there's $10 in circulation and something costs $5 and you add, $5 more into circulation, then now there's like 50% more dollars than there should be. And so the price has to go up by 50% too, because of like supply and demand. But that's complete nonsense, because money is the measure of value. And there's no way that could work. I mean, like, inflation is when prices go up. And so in order for that to happen, someone has to change the price. So, i.e. a business has to change the price. And like, what is the step between the government adding more money to the economy and the business adding to the price? Like, no one can ever explain that part of the theory. And
yeah. I mean, I think because so with respect to MMT, it seems like there's two. Yeah, I mean, MMT basically says that the government essentially you're right. It does not need to collect tax revenues in order to spend, right? And that the
unless
idea
it's at full employment.
Unless it's at full
employment,
but
tax in order to control inflation.
Right, but I mean, even then, that's just through economic management. But the fundamental monetary side of this versus the fiscal side is that the government doesn't take in money and spends it. In fact, when it taxes money, your money's destroyed. It's just removed from the economy. It doesn't go back to the government in that sense.
Shoveling
the government
into a giant digital furnace.
Yeah, it's just gone. The government doesn't take your money and then save it and then spend it. It's removing cash from the system. And when the government spends money, it's putting cash into the private sector. And so the MMT is basically saying there's a certain identity between government deficits and government debt and public surpluses. So when the government spends $1 million, it has a $1 million hole, but that's completely offset by the fact that there's now a surplus somewhere in the private sector because that's where it spent the money into. In taxes, all that's really doing is saying, okay, I've put $1 million into the economy, into the private economy, and I'm going to tax 300,000 of it back. So I've put $1 million in, and then I'm going to remove 300,000, and that's basically all that's happening. And the idea that the government, it's the idea that the government now owes someone 700,000 is really not what happened at all. The 700,000 just means that it's a record of the government having put that money into circulation. So
yeah, I think before I learned all this, I didn't really understand the difference between like the deficit and the debt. Because what is, like, if you don't understand what the deficit means and you think that the government has to tax in order to spend, then like what is the difference between the deficit and the debt in that framework? But if you understand that the government issues money, then it's very clear that the deficit is just the amount that it has issued compared to the amount that it has taxed, and the debt is the debt. It's different.
Yeah. But we finance all our deficits with debt, right? So we are tracking it as treasuries, and we're tracking it that way. And so it just reinforces this notion that the government borrows the money that it can't, that it doesn't have in terms of tax revenue in order to finance its spending. And that's not what's going on. I mean, it's not that, like, MMT is not saying like, oh, you don't have to do that. MMT is saying that's not actually what's happening, and that's not what treasuries are.
Right.
And when it comes to treasuries, what MMT is saying is that all a treasury is when, let's say, you hold cash. You're a foreign government, or you're a company, or you're even an individual, and you're holding US dollars. You have cash. What they're saying is that the government is providing you with the option of switching that cash into a different form that pays interest. That's literally all it is. They're not borrowing your money. So, like, let's say China, as an example, they hold probably between $3 and $4 trillion of, quote, U.S. debt.
Oh my God, they're going to take over.
Yeah, they're going to take over, and we're going to be pulling rickshaws for Xi Jinping or whatever, right? And what the MMTers are saying is, no. All that happened is that we created a current account. They have a current account surplus with this, meaning if you look at the history of trade with China, they've sold us about $3 or $4 trillion more worth of stuff cumulatively up to this point than what we've sold them. And so the difference is made up for with cash. They hold $3 or $4 trillion of U.S. Treasury notes, cash. And so the Federal Reserve notes. So they're holding cash. And what we allow them to do is to say, instead of holding cash that pays no interest, we'll provide you with a federal subsidy wherein you can switch your cash over to your savings account at the Federal Reserve, and we'll now call them Treasury notes, and it'll pay some nominal interest rate. And the reason China doesn't hold cash and holds Treasury notes is because why wouldn't you take the free interest? And that's all that happens. They just debit the cash account at the Federal Reserve and they credit the securities account, the savings account. And suddenly they are earning 0.01% interest on their cash. We call that debt because it's a treasury note, but that's all that happened is they literally just transferred their cash to another account that pays interest. And so
just in case anyone's curious why you wouldn't do that, if the U.S. decides they don't like you anymore, then they can just decide to freeze your assets if you hold them in a U.S.-controlled account. As we saw with Venezuela and their tons and tons of gold at the London Bank, the Bank of England.
That not only did they freeze it, they gave control of it over to Guaido.
Yeah,
which is fucking insane. Like, not like, can you imagine if JP? Not only did we freeze your account, but we gave it to like the guy you hate the
greatest
most.
enemy.
Yeah, like that's what we did. Like we literally fucking did that. It's just fucking crazy. I can't believe we did that. And then we threatened Iraq with it. Like,
yeah,
it's just fucking nuts.
So just to go through, what are the basic operations that a government can do to spend money or to collect money? So the first one, the main one that the U.S. uses is the government issues debt, which means household buyers or I'm sure other governments or businesses use their bank deposits to pay for treasuries, which is what you were just explaining. And so the treasuries go into their bank account, which reduces the bank's deposit liability. So the bank owes less money in deposits to the account holder. And it also drains its reserves because it used cash to pay for the treasuries. But overall, it increases the assets and liabilities of the government and decreases the assets and liabilities of the private sector. So that's like the main way that the U.S. government would spend money nowadays. Mm-hmm. It can also just use treasury deposits to pay for stuff, which goes like basically the treasury deposits go to banks, which means they increase their reserves and their deposit liabilities. So they have more. They have treasuries in reserve that are added to the bank, and they have corresponding deposit liability that is owed to the person that the money is spent on, if that makes sense. So that the household or business that sold the goods increases their deposit assets. So they have an asset corresponding to the deposit liability at the bank, which means they now have that money that was given to them by the government. And then the last one is the government can tax people, which that one's pretty obvious. You know, they basically demand money from you and you give it to them. Bank reserves and deposit liabilities are used for that. So when you're taxed, your bank pays the government that amount in tax, which reduces their reserves and also their deposit liabilities to you. So one of the big things about MMT is, the economy is based on balance sheets all over the place. And so any payment causes a paired asset and liability entry in a double entry balance sheet. So that's like one of the main things that MMT does is they follow the asset and liability entries around the economy to see like how everything works.
Yeah, I mean, starting with that idea that any government expenditure which puts the federal government into deficit, puts the private sector into surplus.
Yep.
Right. So anytime you see a headline that's like, U.S. deficits reach record highs, it's the same headline could read U.S. private surpluses reach record highs, which is a much more positive sounding thing. It doesn't sound as scary.
Yeah, MMT people love taunting conservatives by saying like if you think the private sector is good, then you should love deficits.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So one of the things that EconViz is focused on is showing you how the government can spend without borrowing. So in the basic operations, government spending involves two steps: issuing debt and spending. So it gives banks treasuries, and then sorry, hold on. It's hard for me to keep track of all this stuff. It issues treasuries and then uses the treasuries to pay for goods and services.
That's the traditional view, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the other way that it can do that is just by just spending, because it issues money. So like the main reason that the US doesn't do this, according to them, is because of gold standard laws. Like back when we were on the gold standard, there were a bunch of laws relating to it that as MMT people describe it, are all just self-imposed constraints. So those laws didn't exist because they're like natural laws and that's how things have to work, but because they're ideological laws passed because like people believed in metalism essentially. And so there are laws that prevent the government from like directly issuing treasuries. I think that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. But MMT is saying that is what we do. So MMT is saying that if you actually follow the breadcrumbs in terms of how the government spends money, it just spends it. It doesn't have to get the money first.
Right.
The money actually comes from spending, right?
Gold standard era laws are still in place that prevent the central bank from buying debt directly from the treasury in the manner shown here. However, those same laws allow the central bank to buy treasury debt on the secondary market.
Right.
The latter approach simply adds two steps to the process. The treasury sells debt to primary dealers who know the central bank stands ready to buy the debt from them immediately afterwards. So they basically just insert a middleman into the process and say, like, this is how things should really work.
Like Cantor Fitzgerald or something. But
they
know that the central bank is there. They call it the FOMC, right? Federal Open Markets Committee. They set the price. They're the market maker in that whole thing. And they've got a list of like 40 or 50 primary dealers. But they're just making markets. Like they're just earning little spreads and commissions.
Speaking of the FOMC, I was just reading today criticism of David Graeber's book by some guy that has this weird thing, like has it out for him basically. And one of the big criticisms was the FOMC has 3 board members, but David Graeber said that it only has 1.
And
so he used that as like
shred the book.
David Graeber's book is completely wrong. He doesn't even know how many board members there are in the FOMC.
This is the thing. Like, I'm not saying that MMT is necessarily 100% right or whatever. I'm just saying that whenever I've brought it up with people, like that, the worst are people that actually know a little bit about money operations or know a little bit about how the market works, and they start throwing shit at you that doesn't actually mean anything, but they'll say stuff like, MMT totally ignores the yield curve. You have to think about the yield curve. Or it totally ignores the idea that there's a huge, massive Eurodollars market. And I'm like, I understand what the yield curve is. I understand what Eurodollars is. I don't understand how that's connected to MMT at all. And and then the attitude is then like, MMT doesn't properly explain the existence of these things, so it's bullshit. I'm like, it doesn't seek to explain the existence of this stuff. I'm like, but I think people do. I mean, the worst are people that know a bit about this and then throw up smoke screens to sort of give you the idea that they've have this like really elaborately thought out rebuttal to something that they never even really heard the full or even tried to comprehend. And then they'll say stuff like, well, it just doesn't explain the yield curve. What does that mean? How does that how does that relate to what MMT is trying to say? I've noticed this a lot with people in terms of argumentation about stuff like the economy. I don't know what it is, but people, I suspect that it comes from, sorry if I'm taking this off track. I know that we're talking about, but like, I think it's because people we're so ingrained with the idea that money doesn't grow on trees.
Yes.
That money is inherently valuable. That money represents hard work. And there's almost an ethic to money. Like there's some sort of, moral quality.
If you
to
make money, it's because you help people.
And
That's the basic
you're
idea, I think.
And that and you suffered. You suffered for that money. You delayed instant gratification. You put in the sweat and equity. And here comes these, economists that are seen as left wingers, which is not true. MMT is, to me, politically neutral, and I think we should get into that. But
yes, we should.
It's not a inherently left wing thing at all. I think it's in many ways very right wing. And
I think a lot of the original exponents of MMT are pretty right wing.
I think Mosler's pretty libertarian right wing.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the critics of MMT seem to fall into two camps. One is people like Matt Brunig, who they think that MMT is just this insidious effort to get rid of real social programs and institute a job guarantee so that we have a bunch of make-work jobs and force people to labor to have a basic standard of living. And the other camp is people like Noah Smith, who are pro-austerity neoliberals who are just against the idea of the government freely spending money on social programs. And so all their concern trolling is about that kind of stuff.
Right, right.
Yeah. And I mean, the job guarantee is a big part of MMT, and it's not the ideal social program, I don't think, but I don't think it's a bad thing, and I don't think make-work jobs are bad. I think it's fine to have a make-work job. Plenty of people would be fine with leaving their current shitty job to get a better paid job where they most likely spend all day tweeting because it's a make-work job. I don't think most people would have a problem with that. I don't know.
I mean, the FJG is just something that some MMTers have proposed as something that the government could do, right? Which is to say that the federal government, because it's not doesn't have any it's not constrained by money budgets, can just create federal jobs guarantee that essentially sets a minimum floor to the private labor market.
Right.
So at any point, someone could say, if the job paid too low or the conditions were too shitty, they'd say, fuck you, I'm going to go, sort mail at the post office or whatever the fuck for $8 an hour because fuck you, and I can't get fired from that job. So it's going to be, FJG is not, I don't know, it doesn't sound great, but that's the theory, right? Is that the federal government can create some floor below which the standards of to go any lower than that would not necessarily be illegal, but then you would just get people saying, fuck you, I'm going to go get a federal job. And
the people that are most against it are people who are in favor of universal basic income, which is what we actually talked about last time you were on here.
Yeah.
And their arguments get really weird because they basically boil down to the private sector is more efficient and better at allocating resources because they're well, you can create all these jobs, but that doesn't mean that they'll be useful jobs or be able to do anything good, or people won't have the proper training. The government can't do that, and blah blah, all this just made up shit basically.
Yeah.
And it's all to defend the completely not mutually exclusive idea of the government should do a universal basic income.
Yeah. Federal jobs guarantee is kind of like UBI in a certain way, but it's kind of saying well, we just are making the conditions such that you're instead of universal basic income, it's a universal basic job. Yeah. And so the only difference is to get your UBI, you've got to show up at the job warehouse.
Yes.
And do some shit, and it doesn't even have to be productive, but they're just saying we're going to take your workday from you. in exchange for the federal UBI, and we want to really encourage you to go get, you know, a proper job, because this one's not going to be very good. It's going to be like, you know, pretty bad pay, pretty boring work. You know,
I think that's the Mosler view on it, which is,
yes, that's the Mosler view.
That's the main reason that UBI people are opposed to it, is because they see it as means tested UBI, like UBI with a work requirement is how they characterize it. And for Mosler's view of the world, probably correct, because he has said that, like, people should have to work in order to get, you know, a basic standard of living.
Yeah.
But then you have the left-wing version of it, which is like the Green New Deal, where it's like, okay, well, we need sweeping change to all of society, and there's currently no business that is planning to do that. So the government should just do it itself and employ millions of people with good-paying jobs to, you know, do this really huge, massive change to society, and just do so by issuing money and paying it to people, and that will revitalize the economy and prevent climate change. Mm-hmm. Which sounds good to me.
Yeah, why not?
I don't know. I don't see anything wrong with
it. They should do something, and I think, for me, the reason, maybe we should start talking about the political outcomes here. But like, I mean, and MMT, I think, is a very dangerous theory to sort of take at face value. I almost wonder if this whole deficit mythology is like necessary in a way. It's like a necessary myth. Because the outcome, if we were to accept MMT as sort of orthodox explanation of how money actually works, it kind of and the funny thing was, I actually brought this up with I met what's his name, Bhaskar Sundara, and I talked to him about MMT, and I said, because they did this like thing in Brooklyn, there was like a public event, and I had suggested, because they were asking, they were polling the audience, like, what do you want us to talk about? And I said, you all need to talk about MMT, and they didn't want to talk about it. And then afterwards, I was talking to Sundara, and I said, how come you guys don't want to talk about MMT? And he said, because part of the Bernie platform is to tax the rich, and if MMT is accepted, there's really no basis for calling for more taxes, because we don't need their money to spend money. And I think that's one of the dangers of MMT, is like it might be that the more likely outcome, or the more likely result of it, is that the tax hawks actually get more out of, or the deficit hawks get more out of it, because they're like, look, the government is admitting that it doesn't need your money, but it taxes you anyway. And I think it's much easier to get Americans to be like, yeah, I don't want to pay taxes, than to say, oh yeah, I want the government to do big things, you know?
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, it doesn't like completely destroy the idea that we should tax the rich, because, I mean, like, inequality is a problem in itself. Mm-hmm. So there is a good reason to tax rich people, which is to take their money away. But that's very, very unpopular in the U.S., I think. So
exactly, it's like we're not ready
for political
to
expediency. Yet. I think, I would probably agree with them, I guess.
Yeah. I think there are some necessary myths that we need, because, like, as a people, like, there's just certain things that we have not accepted yet, like that the vast majority of us will never be rich. Mm-hmm. And that you should hate the rich, therefore, we haven't accepted that concept. You know, like, we still all think of ourselves as potential future billionaires, and so, you know.
By the way, if you're listening to this and you work for a right-wing think tank, nothing we're saying is true. Deficits do matter. You do have to tax in order to spend, and the government can't issue money.
Yes, yeah. It all depends on what your intentions are. Affects what is true.
We could have unlimited social programs or unlimited fascism. God damn it.
I mean, you know, the nature of money doesn't doesn't dictate what your politics are. It doesn't dictate, you know, it's just like, yeah, this is the truth. The U.S. government can never go broke. It can always afford anything in the world that's ever priced in dollars, and it doesn't need to tax anybody for it. And whether what we choose to do with that reality is kind of up to us, you know.
It is a thin line that Bernie is trying to walk, though, because he has to balance his concern with, like, we want to accept their framing on how are you going to pay for it in order to do wealth redistribution, but then also, like, that means you have to show some math to say, like, yes, this social program we're creating has a corresponding tax revenue to it, which may not always be the case.
Yeah.
But I guess once they get it passed, then it doesn't matter as much. So I don't know.
But wasn't it like under Obamacare, there were like there was we didn't call it a tax, we called it a mandatory premium. And so it was like that. Well, remember, like, it was, you know, under Obamacare, I don't know what the hell happened to the bill, because it's been a lot of components have been removed from it. Yeah. But originally the idea was that you know, it would mandate that we all would have to go out and buy private insurance, and right. And that if you didn't do it, it would be a penalty. The government would essentially charge you premium anyway. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that was challenged in the Supreme Court to say, like, well, the government can't charge you a premium. Like, you know, you can't, you know, this is like, but essentially they were trying to say, like, the government can't force us to buy something.
Right.
And so the government responded to say, all right, how about this? How about instead of us pretending that we're forcing you to go buy something, we just call it what it is. It's a tax. We're taxing you, you know. And so, and then the Justice Roberts swung back to saying that that's okay. Well, the government is allowed to tax, and these mandatory premiums are taxes. And so, what I'm saying is that, like, it doesn't matter. You can call it a premium, whatever the fuck you want. It doesn't matter. Like, it is the same thing. And so if Bernie's saying, like, okay, how do you fund Medicare for all? Well, we got to tax you. I mean, he could just as well go out and say, well, we're going to charge you premiums.
Yeah.
You know, like, what do you think we're going to do? But it doesn't really matter, you know?
Yeah, they're all just different names for the same thing.
Yeah, it's all just, I mean, and I think that's...
You give someone else money.
Like, exactly.
That's what it ultimately is.
Yeah. And so I guess that's kind of like what he's doing. He's playing this game now of saying, like, well, assuming that we can't have Medicare for all without having to cut something else. It kind of boils down to the same thing. So it's public. I mean, it's just basically universal payer, right? Sorry, single payer.
Yes.
And we all have the same insurer, and we're all paying the same premiums to the same insurer. It's not exactly like, you know, a new program, right? He's just saying, like, we're just going to consolidate all of our private insurance into a single government run insurer. That's it, you know?
Yeah, one of the other things that really got me riled up during the debates was, you know, Bernie, of course, is saying, you know, we're going to move to single payer healthcare, which is going to lower the cost of healthcare, and I have a plan to pay for it, and overall the amount that you pay is going to go down. And all of the right-wing Democrats were like, we shouldn't do that. We don't need that. We should just lower the cost of healthcare. But then they never actually describe how they plan to do that. It's just like, oh, so you have a cost of healthcare lever in the White House and you're just going to decide to pull it? Why didn't you just do that before, you fucking assholes?
You know what they really mean? They're like, we have a bunch of Pete Buttigieg types that have a lot of great ideas because they speak all sorts of Norwegian languages and drink fancy wines, and they've got PowerPoints like you wouldn't fucking believe.
They're gonna get with all their friends that work in the health insurance industry, sitting on the board, and they're gonna say, "Please, sir, can you lower healthcare prices for us?"
They've got 4 to 5 bullet points that are gonna knock your socks off in terms of the creativity and out of the box thinking that they've put into the PowerPoint. It's out of the box. It's in the PowerPoint. It's gonna knock your socks off. These ideas that we're gonna do. And you're like, what are the ideas? They're like, they're crazy. They're just nuts. We're going to talk about it some other time.
Like, I think one person did let slip that the way that they supposedly can lower the cost of healthcare is by having Medicare and Medicaid negotiate prices, or by having the government limit like the prices that they will pay. So it's like, okay, so what if we expand Medicare to everyone, and then they can negotiate the cost of healthcare and it'll go down because they're the only option.
Right.
But of course they don't want to do that. They would rather control about taking people's choices away.
Yeah.
Not my precious choice.
you know, what do you think is going to happen like this during is it going to be all about, I mean, is
like
this going to be
general?
Yeah, like, is this going to be the issue? Because I don't know if it's going to be, but it is, because it just still shocks me that like there's a lot of Americans who are like, yeah, I don't really see what's wrong with healthcare in this country because I got mine. You know?
I mean, I don't know, like the idea of single payer healthcare when it's just described like in a value neutral way, like something like 74 or 78% of Americans are in favor of it. Until of course you ask them like, would you want the government to take away your healthcare in order to, you know, make it a giant government run bureaucracy that decides whether you live or die? Then it becomes unpopular. But I mean,
sir, are you pro death panel?
Yeah,
you know, that was shockingly effective. That whole death panel thing.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I can't imagine. Like, I think Trump is going to try and do that. If it's Trump versus Bernie, I'm sure he's going to try and do the death panel thing. But
would you rather your death panels be chosen by Washington or by the folks
Aetna.
at Aetna? Like,
yeah.
Would you rather your death panelists draw a private salary or a government salary? How would you feel?
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard him use that argument of like, it's either public or private bureaucracy. There's no outcome where we don't have a bureaucracy deciding whether you live or die.
Yeah.
The only choices are Aetna or the government. But
Yeah.
I'm hoping that that's what Bernie goes with if Trump tries to talk about it with him during a debate. But I have a feeling it's just going to be Trump rambling about how toilets don't work or whatever. I don't know.
I saw that one. He was like, we've got these dishwashers. He's like, I'm approving dishwashers that are going to be, they're going to get them clean on the first try, folks. And then
you have to put your dishes in 4 or 5 times.
No more. These are just one shot. We're changing things. And they go nuts. And you know, the thing is, like, you live in Virginia, right?
Yep.
Like, so he gave everyone Christmas Eve off this year, all the federal employees. And I'm like, he's going to win Virginia. Those little things, those little favors, they matter. They're not going to forget that.
Yeah, like Bush giving everyone $200 for his reelection.
The post 9/11 go shopping. Like everyone got.
The best way to fight terrorism is by doing exactly what you're already doing.
Yeah. I remember that. He was literally like, don't stop shopping. Don't stop shopping.
Yeah.
That's how you kill America, is you stop shopping. So here's $200. Go get yourself something nice and shut the fuck up.
So let's see, what else can we talk about here? So one of the things the Federal Reserve does is they sell treasuries and buy treasuries to and from commercial banks. And the reason for this is to target interest rates. I don't really understand like what their goal is when they're trying to target a certain interest rate, but basically they're just like swapping cash for treasuries with commercial banks in order to get them to offer loans at a specific interest rate.
Oh, you mean when they're targeting the interbank rate, all that stuff? Like
like the overnight.
Yeah, I mean they're just that's the primary role of the Federal Reserve, right? They have a two-pronged mission. One is to manage inflation, and the other is to manage employment. And their job is, to And it's all
so this
based
is to
on
try and control inflation.
it's to try and balance inflation against employment. They want they want to reach full employment, but they don't want inflation going through the roof or whatever. And so it's based on this belief that the closer you get to full employment, the more your inflation is going to go up. And one of their main lever is really simple. It's just controlling interest rates, because their belief is that interest rates set the amount of private growth and private activity. And, it's all kind of bullshit, but like if you lower interest rates.
Let's just describe the whole theory here. So, because they don't even control inflation, apparently. They just control the amount of treasuries that commercial banks have.
They're guiding it.
So it's like
they're trying to guide it. Yeah.
Treasuries at commercial banks inform their decision on interest rates, which informs their decision on how much money they lend, which informs businesses' decisions on how much money they borrow, which affects how many people they hire, which affects the employment rate, which affects something, which then affects the amount of inflation that exists. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, they're blackboxing the entire private economy, the free market economy, so to speak, to say, if we can control this sort of like all-encompassing variable of how much credit costs, then we will basically, it's like a voltage. It's basically like thinking of the private economy as some kind of circuit board, and the interest rate is the voltage. And so if we lower it, we're kind of juicing the economy a bit, and it's going to go kick into high gear. And it's not. And then the fear is that if it kicks into high gear, then it starts creating inflation, right?
Yeah.
And that's the view of it, and it's just not fucking happening. First of all, our interest rates are basically zero. Like we're getting close to negative interest rate territory, meaning like it would be cheaper to get a loan than to not. like whatever the fuck that means, it would be cheaper to get a loan than to not get a loan. And it's getting to that point. And what we're seeing is full employment, but we know the numbers are kind of cooked in bullshit, and what we consider employment is kind of bullshit. But anyway, we're getting to what the Federal Reserve on its dashboard considers full employment, and there's no inflation in sight, not even close. The problem has been deflation. The problem has been that there's just like really not enough aggregate demand and to meet the overproduction. And what we're really seeing when the Fed is doing zero interest rate policy, ZIRP, is we're doing nothing but inflating financial assets, and that includes housing. So I think here, I live in New York City. Here, I think last year there were more than 50% of all the real estate sales that were closed last year were sales to investment companies, were sales to basically like REITs, real estate mutual funds, basically. And so housing is a financial asset. The stock market's through the fucking roof, if you noticed. All financial assets in America have been inflated because of the fact that now when you set interest rates low, the private economy, part of it that's actually productive, it doesn't have any more investments to make. Like we can't sell any more of the shit that we produce. There's not enough demand. And so what happens is, we get all these like, the financialized sector of the economy full of asset managers, hedge fund managers, et cetera, like, money's on the cheap. Let's just go buy a bunch of money, and then we'll leverage it to go buy assets that'll give us a slightly higher return. We're going to long-term capital management this shit. We're gonna arbitrage the ridiculously low rates to borrow cash, and we'll just go buy something that gives us a marginally better return, be it S&P 500 stocks or
fracking land.
Yeah, exactly. Like anything. Like, oil. We'll just go buy some fucking oil.
Yeah.
If there's a war, we'll go buy some Lockheed Martin stocks, whatever. And that's all that it is. And it's not creating any more. I think real economic growth is still very low. And so basically what I'm saying is that the Federal Reserve's original mission just doesn't make sense anymore, because inflation is not the fear.
Yeah. Another like folk understanding of inflation says that inflation is actually good if you're in debt. Again, because of this idea that inflation is when money becomes less valuable. So I've heard this a number of times. I haven't seen it or heard it in a while, but the idea is if you have $10,000 worth of debt, then when inflation happens, now it's only worth $8,000. And so that's good because that means you have to pay less. But like the nominal value is still $10,000. So
yeah, but it
even
makes
though your
sense.
money is less valuable because everything else is more expensive, that just means like you're spending more money on all of the other shit that you spend money on, and you still have the same amount of debt.
Oh yeah, but when they say this stuff, I assume that they're not talking about people, right? Like nobody gives a shit about people. They're talking about like if you're a business. I mean, it's all this macro investment shit. It's like, okay, if you the whole point of debt is as a vehicle to capitalize your investments, right? So like
Right.
if you're a company, I borrow, I take on debt in order to invest it into productive activities, and that productive activity makes me more money than it costs to service that debt, which is kind of goes in line at a macro level with the idea that inflation, which is an indicator of growth, that
I mean, I guess if the inflation is you as a business are raising your prices, then yes, inflation does ease your debt burden because now you're getting more income from your higher prices.
Yeah, I'm making more money than I'm making far more money through the capital that I invested in financed with debt than I am in terms of costs I'm incurring as the interest rate service of the debt, right? So the whole idea is if I lower for the Federal Reserve that wants to jumpstart the economy, if I lower interest rates to near zero, virtually any productive activity, so long as it brings in a marginal profit of anything, is going to be better is going to be more profitable for you. Then
you would lose an interest.
Then you would lose an interest, right? So go borrow money and just do anything that's marginally productive. And they're like, okay, we'll borrow it and buy stocks. And we'll recognize the profit in the form of a mark to market, meaning unrealized gains, which are, of course, that's a bubble because once everyone tries to realize their gain at the same time, the whole thing falls apart. And so we just inflate asset bubbles. I mean, I think that's the thing is like there's the theory and then there's the reality. The reality is that we're just creating asset bubbles and we're not really doing shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's the new hot Silicon Valley thing? The last big thing I heard about was WeWork, which is failing. Yeah.
That's all Saudi money.
I guess SoftBank is like the big focus of everyone now, which is just like, giving people boatloads of Saudi oil money, hoping that they'll eventually be able to monopolize a market and collect rents from it. That's like the whole tech business model.
Yeah, I mean, when you have that much cash floating around at that cheap, and you have oil money, like you literally have like hundreds of billions of dollars that has nowhere to go. There's no new investments to buy into.
Right.
You just empower the most, convincing showman to manufacture an investment idea, and the bigger the better because I got $500 billion that I have, and I don't know where the fuck to put it. Give me a reason. Whatever. Like it doesn't matter. Like
I remember seeing some clip in like 2010, like right after the financial crisis, where someone was trying to explain like how the like securities derivatives market works, and he was like, so basically rich guys meet in a bar or something like that, and then they take a cocktail napkin and they write $500 billion on it, and then they hand it to another rich guy who then takes a different cocktail napkin and writes $800 billion in it and hands it back to the other guy. Like that's all the economy is.
Yeah. That's the financial, like, everyone's like complaining about or pointing out like how the economy is getting financialized. I think this is what it is. It's like we're just creating notional bets and stuff. Like we're not doing anything with the money,
Yeah.
Or what you could do is you could pour it into construction projects that are like totally unnecessary. And so that's another thing. Like, but see, that's cooler because at least you could see it. At least it doesn't seem so illusory.
At least you can have a big, tall, ugly building that's completely empty all the time.
Like Hudson Yards. like Hudson Yards. Like literally, like there's this huge
Park Avenue.
Yeah, it's like these 50 fucking these 50-story fucking condos that are like 30% sold, and it's all investors anyway. So like at night, like they turn on lights just to make it look like people are in there, but really if they were to only let residents turn on lights, the whole thing's fucking dark, and it's like a 50-story condo in the middle of a city that everyone says is short on housing, and no one's living in this fucking thing. Yep. And like, okay, well, see, that's what happens when you have cheap credit. Like, there's nothing to do with it, so it'll go to someone, a Trump-like person who's like, oh, I've got the greatest building, it's going to be awesome, there's going to be like a David Chang restaurant in it. There's going to be coffee. There's going to be Blue Bottle coffee. It's fair trade. It's going to be great, guys. It's going to be great. And then they build it because it looks like a real investment opportunity. Because you could see it. You're like, whoa, that thing's really tall. It's completely fucking useless,
Right. I guess the general theory that we can take away from all this stuff, like including the how the Federal Reserve controls inflation, and how the federal government is supposed to do social programs, and how we're supposed to fight the housing crisis, which is like right wingers always want to portray the economy as this big Rube Goldberg machine that's so complex that no mere mortal can understand it, except with years of study, and you can't do anything directly. You have to pull the levers on the Rube Goldberg machine and hope that it gets the outcome you want, because otherwise something bad will happen. We don't exactly know what that is, but
Stalinism will happen.
Yeah. If the federal government were to pay for everyone's health care, then it's going to kill 100 million people, and that's just what happens every time.
Famines, literally famines. We're all going to die from lack of yams.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I think that is the lesson. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, like, the thing with the housing crisis is like, it's actually good to build these investment properties because, when a rich person buys a house, obviously they have to do something with their current house. They're not just going to stay there. So they move into their new place, and then that place is vacant. And so someone who's slightly less rich can buy that house now because somehow they can afford it for some reason. And then they leave their house, and so someone less rich than them can afford it. And then eventually that makes its way down to the poorest or the richest homeless person who can now afford the cheapest house. And,
what's amazing
eventually...
What's amazing is that the thing you just described, which is obviously not how things work, that is the Rube Goldberg mechanism that's supposed to be so hard to understand that, like, we can't do it directly. Like, oh, the rich guy moves into an even bigger house and then everyone just slots up. That's too complicated for us to understand. That's not what happens at all, first of all. And second, it doesn't seem that complicated, like, but that is, I mean, that's how people will go about saying, like, well, I mean, they're all like, it's way too complicated. And then they proceed to tell you exactly how things don't work. And,
yeah. I mean, if you look at any post about Colorado housing, especially Denver housing, you'll see this argument deployed all over the place, because people will, like, people that are normal and have normal functioning brains will say, like, hey, why don't we just build affordable housing so that people can live in a house? Mm-hmm. And then you have the people that say, no, that doesn't work. What we actually have to do is build housing for rich people so that eventually it trickles down to the poorest people. And here's an article that proves that this is how it works. And it's like some econ study on a simulation of housing markets where eventually, after 15 years, building housing for the rich trickles down to poor people. And
okay,
so
never mind that wealth is distributed in a pyramid.
Yeah.
So like the 10
that's good.
10 billionaires in Denver, or however many, like 3 billionaires in Denver, are going to buy 3 new houses and sell their old fucking $8 million house to like someone slightly poorer than them. But there's 10 of those guys. And then the Mitt Romney level.
You don't understand how revealed preference works, Teen, because if someone buys a 8,000 square foot mansion, then if that wasn't available before, then they would have had the same thing the market would support, which is 2 4,000 square foot mansions.
Oh, right.
And so they vacate those, and then they become available for slightly less rich people.
Right. The $8 million house subdivides into 2 $4 million houses through mitosis. And then it's organic, or it's an organic thing. It's too hard to explain. Yeah, you're right. I mean, look, with respect to this sort of takeaway, I think that's right. Like what we were talking about, what we were describing in terms of like how, just simply sitting back and manipulating interest rates, which is called monetary policy, does not lead to good outcomes. The private market doesn't know what to do with that money. And it's not necessarily that it doesn't know, it can't do it. There are things that the private markets cannot do, no matter how cheap the funding is. Like we can't go out, like one insurer cannot take all that cheap money, go out and then suddenly gain market power, purchaser power in the market for healthcare. It can't do that. There's things that only the government can do, and that if you look at the ways in which monetary policy has run up against a brick wall, you're looking at it. We've basically, the Federal Reserve is out of ammunition. It's done quantitative easing, sort of essentially subsidizing private debt at this point. And meaning that the central bank's essentially directly lending money out to the public now is what QE is.
Yeah. And despite adding like trillions of dollars into circulation through quantitative easing, there's not been any corresponding inflation.
All it's done is make stocks more expensive. So if you own stocks, that might be good for you. It's made your housing more expensive. If you own housing, that's probably been good for you. And it's made a lot of it's made a lot of empty skyscrapers pop up in places like Miami and New York and LA. And that's it. That's the limit of fiscal of monetary policy. What MMT is saying is that in order for us to actually progress the economy, and these are all pro-growth, pro-capitalist ideas in a sense. Like this isn't even like, this is like pretty mainstream shit. Is like, if you want to stoke more capitalistic economic growth, you're going to have to look towards the government through fiscal policy, meaning we need government spending, because there's things that the private market simply cannot do just because you've made credit available, right? And we don't see anyone going into the affordable housing market. We don't see anyone, like, it's impossible for us to go and the other thing that it's done, of course, is to inflate college tuitions through their fucking roof, through government subsidies of
guaranteed loans.
Through guaranteed loans. The only aspect of it didn't improve the number of people going to college, or it didn't improve the quality of education. It just made tuitions go sky high. Same way that subsidy of mortgage interest, which would be much higher than 3.2% or whatever they are right now, without government guarantees, right? So all we do is we go and subsidize interest rates. And what do we see? We see increasing prices, but we don't see any better outcomes. Like, all that happens is just shit gets more expensive for us. And we service more debt. That's it.
I think you also raise a good point that we can relate back to the MMT viewing the economy in terms of balance sheets thing, which is if something becomes more expensive for someone, then on the other side of that, there's someone who benefits from that. Mm-hmm. So the increasing cost of healthcare benefits the people who administer healthcare. The increasing cost of housing benefits the people who own housing. And then, like, you know, on the converse, the reduced cost of like taking a taxi that Uber and Lyft have brought about is a detriment to people who drive you around. So, like, the economy is inherently conflictual. You know, buyers and sellers always have opposing interests. Mm-hmm. And so, like, if you want to reduce just the bad shit that happens in the economy, like, a great way to do that is by having the government take it over, because A, they can issue money, B, they are not interested in trying to raise revenue, and C, they don't have to compete with anyone. If they completely take over an industry, there's only one entity that is administrating it, and they don't have to raise or lower their prices in order to, you know, push out a competitor. So, like, the reason that single payer healthcare is good is, for one, it's free, obviously free to the person that's using it. Two, you know, the money doesn't have to come out of anyone's pocket in order for the you know, the doctors and hospital staff and all that stuff, all of those people, to be paid. And, like, there's no one who has an interest in, like, raising the cost of it, because they wouldn't get any additional benefit from that, except for maybe doctors and, you know, people that are getting paid, basically.
And they should be paid. Doctors should be paid. You know, like, those who manufacture useful drugs should be paid, and they will. Yeah. You know,
let's see. Do you have anything else to talk about with MMT?
No, I mean, I think it's super interesting. I think it's essentially MMT, in my opinion, is what's gonna the economy as we just isn't very good. It's not just not big enough and not growing fast enough, but it's not providing the things that people need, right? Especially in education, especially housing and healthcare, right? Those key areas, social areas, and retirement. And we have reached the absolute limits of what the free market can provide, to the point where the government is basically nothing but a provider of credit to the free market, and they still can't provide these things for us. And so it's just a point now where I think we've got to start looking at, in my opinion, and it's probably a politicized statement to say this, but I do think we really need to start looking at using the government, taking the state as an active provider and producer of those things.
Yeah. Since we mentioned UBI earlier, and I think I can connect it to this, again, people who are in favor of UBI are generally against MMT for whatever reason, because they see UBI as the opposite of the job guarantee or something. And I think most of the arguments in favor of UBI are right-wing arguments, or at least they are arguments that don't acknowledge the reality of MMT, or at least chartalism, because, like, the biggest argument that they use is, besides, like, it's good for people, which, okay, sure, I agree with that, but also their biggest argument is it costs less than other social programs because all you're doing is adding money to people's accounts. But if you're spending government money, who gives a shit how much it costs? It doesn't matter. The government can just create money, so it doesn't matter if it's cheaper or not. That's not a good argument. And then the other one is it gives people more choices, but, like, it's not a mystery what things people need. People need, like, the biggest things that people spend money on are rent, education, healthcare, utilities, and food. It's not like a mysterious thing. There's not like some person out there that doesn't need food or doesn't need to pay rent that we need to worry about for our government programs. Yeah. So just Just fucking like nationalize housing, nationalize education. You know, have a single purveyor of, you know, housing and utilities and education and food, and like you don't need a UBI if they're all free at the point of use. Then like I don't know, like the idea that people need to choose to spend their money on rent and utilities, it just doesn't make much sense to me. And then we talked about last time how, you know, if you get $1,000 UBI, in all likelihood, your landlord is going to raise your rent by, you know, if not $1,000 outright, pretty close to it.
Yeah, they'll poo-poo those arguments to say like, oh, well, we can always...
Oh, sorry, you dropped out.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, they'll always say like, oh, well, we there's ways to deal with that. We can always deal with that later, or like, what the fuck does that mean? Yeah, UBI is trash. UBI is a fucking old idea. I mean, it was meant to. UBI was proposed originally, you know, like way back as the negative income tax, simply as a way to recognize that a lot of people were going to lose their jobs once we started to neoliberalize, once we started to dismantle the welfare state and hand control of so much of the economy into private hands, that necessarily people were going to get laid off and kicked out of the economy altogether because they're not needed. And we were like, well, they shouldn't starve. So maybe we need no. I mean, this was right. This was like
yeah.
You know, during the Reagan era when we were really moving towards liberalizing the economy, and they knew.
Certainly, there were people saying, well, maybe they should though.
Maybe they should die. Yeah, well, that's the funny thing is like. Even the most cold-hearted, you know, liberalizers out there, like, you know, the Milton Friedmans were saying, we need to offer some sort of cushion for people that are going to be dislocated because of these transformations in the economy. And they were like, the implementers were like, no, we don't. Fuck them.
Early economic writing is full of people who not only do not think that we need to make sure that people are able to eat, but that actually scarcity is good because it whips in the indolent peasants into productive industry, and that's what that's what the source of real happiness is. So, like when France was having all sorts of famines, you know, killing loads of people and, you know, starving the ones who survived, that was actually good because they were happier because they were thankful for the little that they had.
It's it's just really brutal.
Yeah.
Like we've become more brutal.
Extremely fucked up. Yeah.
And I think we've been educated into it. And it's very, yeah, it's just, I don't know. For me, it's just like, I've seen the change, you know, over decades where I do think we've been educating people to be these cold, like realists, like the more realist, like this whole idea of like, you can't get, there's nothing comes for free.
You can't just do things.
You can't just do things.
The Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah. Like everything, like there's just a finite supply of shit and it's got to be given to the richest because they're the smartest and they only they know how to apportion stuff. And
but the finite supply is money, not the resources that we're extracting. Those are infinite.
Those are infinite, but they're limited by money.
About. We can do unlimited pollution.
Yeah,
we can put as much carbon into the atmosphere and catch as many fish as we want. That's fine.
Yes.
But money doesn't grow on trees, even though it literally does.
Yeah, and medical procedures are extremely rare and
yeah.
Like we can't, you know. Like blood tests are extremely rare and difficult to do, as is like basic antibiotic,
insulin, all that stuff.
Hospital rooms are extremely valuable things. There's only so many of them. We can't make more. We don't know where they come from.
But we can make big empty towers for Russian oligarchs to buy.
Those we can make.
No problem there.
Yeah. Exactly, and I think MMT. I am interested just because I think it just really cuts through the mythology. We've mythologized money and budgets and government spending to the point where we can't think clearly about it. And I think MMT sort of makes the money aspect of it a little bit more transparent. Like MMT kind of is a way to not think about money, in my opinion, to say, let's not think about money. Money doesn't matter. Money's bullshit. What really matters,
the bean counters do that.
Yeah, let them handle it. But what really matters is like how many people do you have? How much like natural resources do you have? How much like machinery? How much construction equipment? How much like FTEs? Arable land? Yeah, like how much stuff do you have? And how many doctors do you have? How many nurses do you have? How many like drug manufacturing plants do you have? Like, what is your actual material ability to create healthcare? Like, what is that? Or to create housing or to educate people? And MMT is a way to say, like, don't worry about the money. The money doesn't fucking matter. It's just bullshit. What matters is, do you have an economy that is able to produce these things for people? And are there people around to produce it? And it's just, I think those are the important questions, right? So MMT is a way to not fucking debate money and yield and Eurodollar markets and shit like that, to be like, none of it matters. Finance professionals should be, mid-tier to low-level back office nerds. Like they shouldn't talk. They should only talk amongst them. And they shouldn't, like, what they have to say shouldn't matter to like normal people. Yeah. Right. But the financial people are way too fucking powerful. And they'd love to, like, taunt people with how little they know about esoteric stuff that doesn't matter, like Eurodollar, Euro bond markets, and Euribor, and the LIBOR interest rate setting. Like, shut the fuck up. Nobody cares, So
I'm pretty interested to see if there's ever been like a survey of people's attitudes towards issues that included, like, do you care what the deficit is, or how much like the government is spending on anything? I'm sure it exists. So if anyone knows of that, DM it to me. But I have a feeling that most people, when they hear the argument like, we can't do Medicare for all because it's too expensive, they're like, well, that's bullshit. It's the government. Who cares?
Right.
But I don't know. But I think, I think you summarized it well. And I think that's a good time to wrap it up. We've been going for about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So, Teen, thank you for coming on to talk about this with me. And
thanks for having me, man.
Where can people find you?
They can go to planamag.com. Do sort of Asian American focused politics. We crypto leftists, I guess. It's not clear, always so clear what our politics are, but we do.
Yeah, on episode like 50 or something, you guys were like, "Okay, so just so you all know, we're all leftists."
Yeah, right. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of like, there's a lot of. It would be primarily of interest to like a lot of Asian Americans who, are interested in things like political identity in America and stuff. So planamag.com, and we do a podcast called Escape from Plan A. You can find the links there. Yep.
And your Twitter is at MONT_JIANG, right?
Yes, that's right.
Jang.
Yep.
All right, man.
All right.
Thanks again.
Yeah, good talk. Good catching up.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.